In the last lecture module, we looked at Plato's Euthyphro dilemma, this claim that the divine command theorist has two ways of interpreting or understanding their view. One way, the idea that God wills some action to be morally praiseworthy or wills some action to be morally blameworthy, in part because of the nature of the action or because of the nature of humanity or because of the nature of the world. So some property of the world that is there already, independent of God. That view seems to result in this conclusion that God's will cannot be the exclusive and exhaustive source of moral authority. An action's goodness or badness cannot be merely a product of God's will, since the features that determine what God wills are already there in the world, in the object or the action. On the other hand, if in fact God's will is the exclusive and the exhaustive source of the moral authority for an action or an ethical norm. That is, it's the only reason why lying is bad and telling the truth is good. Then it seems as though there are no justifications for God's choices. There are no reasons. God cannot explain God's choice by referring to those properties of the action or the world or of humanity. Instead, God must simply respond as you might respond after too many questions in a long car drive with your children, because I say so. Now, we might be bothered by this, and we might want to respond to Plato, to claim, in fact, no, Plato, you've gotten ahead of yourself. There are legitimate ways that we can diffuse this dilemma. And in this module, we're going to look at some of those possible strategies. When we hear Plato's argument in the Euthyphro, we might respond to it in the way that I am suggesting here that St. Augustine might respond to it, that rejecting divine command theory is terribly radical, and what we might try instead is to deny that Plato correctly characterizes the divine command theorist's choices. In fact, a natural response notes that the normative force of God's commands comes from reward and punishment within the overall religious worldview. However, those kinds of consequences don't change the nature of the action itself. That you'll get punished for lying isn't why lying is bad, at least not intuitively or obviously. That you'll get punished might provide you with prudential reasons for not lying, but it doesn't seem to make the action good. Consider, for instance, if someone came into your house and held a gun to your head and said, "Cluck like a chicken or I'll shoot you." Now, that sounds like a horrible scenario, but one of the things that we can be pretty certain of is that we're not going to go, until you threaten me with death, I never realized the moral righteousness of clucking like a chicken. No, we would say, I did it because I didn't want to die. So those prudential reasons do not seem to equate to ethical reasons. The authority that one has in virtue of being able to threaten or reward somebody doesn't seem to be the sort of authority that would invest an action with moral goodness or moral badness. Perhaps there's another more sophisticated response that we can make to Plato. Another common response points to God's omnipotence, God's all-powerful nature. Surely he or she or it can make the world such that morality is subject to his or her or its will, while also making it such that morality has an independent status and is not subject to his or her or its will. In other words, we might assume that since God is all-powerful, God can make the impossible possible. However, there's a strong theological tradition dating back to philosophy of religion all the way into the Middle Ages that holds that this can't be true about the nature of God's omnipotence. The argument is often called the incoherence of God's omnipotence, and one person who famously offered this argument up and suffered consequences for it, actually, was this fellow down here in the bottom right, Baruch de Espinosa, or simply Spinoza. The argument goes as follows. If God exists, then God is omnipotent. If God were omnipotent, then God could create a stone so heavy that even God could not lift it. If God could create such a stone, however, then God's powers would be limited. That is, God could not lift the stone. Given I3, that is, given that God's powers are limited, God would not be omnipotent, since there would be something for which God lacks the power. If God could not create the stone, because creating it would limit God's power, then God's powers would also be limited. After all, God cannot create that stone, since doing so would cause God to have a limit to God's powers. Therefore, God cannot be omnipotent, and atheists will often conclude, therefore, God cannot exist. Now, for our purposes, we're not concerned with an atheistic conclusion to this argument. Instead, what we're concerned with is whether or not omnipotence can save divine command theory. And what we see is that the attempt to save divine command theory by appealing to God's omnipotence, in fact, invokes just the sort of incoherence that this argument points to. The attempt to save divine command theory asserts that God can both make morality completely and exhaustively determined by God's will alone, and at the same time can make morality completely dependent upon other things outside of God's will. In other words, the two things can't be done at the same time, seemingly. Philosophy of religion and theology, since the Middle Ages, suggests that, look, what we'll do instead of denying that God exists, we'll instead assert that God's omnipotence is limited by logical possibility. God is all-powerful in the sense that God can do anything that is logically possible. But since our attempt to save divine command theory requires that God do the logically impossible, appealing to omnipotence won't in fact save our theory. Now, this conclusion was by no means a welcome conclusion. In fact, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish church for making arguments like this. And this is an excerpt from his excommunication document. By decree of the angels and by command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Espinoza, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and with the curse which Elijah cursed the boys, and with all of the castigations which are written in the book of the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. So people were very unhappy about this conclusion. Nevertheless, it's pretty widely accepted, so widely accepted that I'll end this lecture module by exerting a section of The Simpsons where Homer presents this argument to Flanders.
It's me, Ned.
All right. The God dude. Hey, I got a question for you. Could Jesus microwave a burrito so hot that he himself could not eat it?
Well, sure, of course he could, but then again, wow, as melon scratchers go, that's a honeydoodle.
Now you know what I've been going